The day my husband announced to the board of directors that he was finally getting rid of the deadweight after our divorce, that deadweight already had a folder in her bag with a full inventory of every company asset. I had been with Graham Mercer for 11 years, married for 10. And for 10 of those years, I ran the operational side of his business. Not officially. Not on paper. Not with a title or a salary or even a business card with my name on it. I was the founder's wife. That was the whole job description as far as anyone knew. The company was called Mercer Logistics Solutions, a mid-sized freight and supply chain firm based in Chicago. 230 employees. Offices in 3 states. Revenue that had tripled in the 7 years since I rebuilt the internal systems from scratch. I say rebuilt. Graham would say grew. He would say grew organically, with strong leadership and a clear vision. I would say I spent 8 months in 2017 building a logistics tracking system that the company still runs on, in a room above our garage, on a laptop I bought with my own money, because Graham said the IT budget was tight that quarter. But none of that was on my business card, because I didn't have one. The annual company gala was held at the Palmer House in Chicago, the 3rd week of November. Graham liked the ballroom there. He liked the way the chandeliers made everything look expensive. He liked standing under them. He won an award that year. Regional Business Leader of the Year from a Chicago Commerce Association he had donated to generously for several consecutive years. The trophy was heavy glass shaped like an angular flame. He held it like he had been waiting for it his whole life. Standing at the podium, in his charcoal suit with the pocket square I had pressed that morning, he said, "I built this company practically from the ground up. Through dedication, through vision, and through an unwillingness to accept anything less than excellence." He paused. He smiled. The room applauded. I sat at table 7, next to Paige Donovan, our CFO, who had been with the company for 4 years and knew exactly where the numbers came from. She didn't look at me when Graham said those words. She looked at her champagne glass and turned it very slowly by the stem. That was the moment I started paying attention to what people did instead of what they said. The other moment that stayed with me from that night was a smaller one. During the cocktail hour, before the dinner, one of the regional managers named Derek came up to me and said, "Vanessa, the new routing system has saved us something like 40 hours a week in dispatch coordination. That was real work you did." Graham was standing 3 feet away. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, exactly. More of a corrective one. "She loves her spreadsheets," he said. "Don't make it bigger than it is." Derek smiled the way people smile when they don't know what else to do. Then he moved toward the bar. I did not say anything. I never said anything at events. I had learned early that saying something created a scene, and scenes were bad for Graham's image, and a bad image was bad for the business I had spent a decade building without being allowed to sign my name to it. The other memory I carry from that period is a dinner at Colin and Margaret Reed's house in Winnetka. Colin was a family friend of Graham's from business school. They played golf together, argued about the Bears together. He was the kind of man who meant well and understood almost nothing. Over lamb chops and a very nice Bordeaux, Colin leaned back in his chair and said, "So Vanessa, when do you become an official partner? You clearly know the business better than anyone." Graham set his wine glass down. "Not everyone who helps in the kitchen becomes the owner of the restaurant," he said. He smiled when he said it. Like it was a joke. Like it was something small and harmless and funny. The table went quiet for a moment. Margaret looked at her plate. Colin laughed a little and changed the subject to the golf course they were thinking of joining. "I cut my lamb." I didn't say anything, but I remember that sentence very clearly. The exact cadence of it. The way he said it, like it was obvious. Like it was even generous, acknowledging that I helped at all. There was one habit Graham had that I think about now more than almost anything else. Whenever we talked about the business, whenever I gave him information or an idea or a solution to a problem, he would reach into his jacket or across the desk and pull out an old leather notebook. Brown, slightly worn at the corners, with a brass clasp. He had carried it for years. He would put it in front of me and say, "Write that down." Not write it down. Write that down. Like it was his thought. Like I was the secretary transcribing something he had produced. I wrote things down in that notebook for years. Meeting notes, system ideas, supplier contacts, contract terms I had negotiated. I wrote his speeches in that notebook. I wrote the pitch that got us our largest client, a regional grocery chain that brought in 11% of annual revenue. I wrote everything in that notebook. Then he closed it and put it back in his jacket. And those ideas became his ideas. And that work became his work. And I was the wife who loved her spreadsheets. I didn't notice how strange this ritual was for a long time. I thought it was efficient. Graham was good at presenting things and I was good at building them, and the notebook was just the handoff point between those two functions. That was how I framed it for years, because framing it any other way would have required me to look at what was actually happening. What was actually happening was that I was producing things and he was claiming them, and the notebook was the mechanism by which my authorship was physically transferred to his pocket. The early years of the marriage were different. Or I believe they were. When we met, Graham was running a small freight brokerage with 6 employees and a lease on office space that smelled like old carpet. He was energetic and charming, and he had ideas that moved fast. I had just finished a master's degree in operations management, and I was working for a consulting firm that paid well and bored me completely. He asked me once, 3 months into our relationship, how I would fix his dispatch system if I could. I told him, in some detail. He listened, which was unusual for him. He usually interrupted. That night he wrote notes on a paper napkin. 6 months later, he implemented the system. He didn't tell anyone where it came from. But he told me, privately, that it had cut his routing errors by 30%. I thought that was a partnership. I thought partnership meant building something together without keeping score. It took me several years to understand that partnership requires both people to agree that it's a partnership. If only one person is counting the contributions as mutual, the other one is just taking. It was a Tuesday in March when everything changed. Not dramatically. Not loudly. The way most things actually change, quietly and almost by accident. I was in the home office at 9 in the evening, printing materials for a board presentation I had prepared on reducing vendor overhead. The printer ran out of the first tray and pulled from the secondary feed. I wasn't paying attention. I was on a call with one of the vendor contacts in Ohio, confirming numbers for the following week. When I hung up and walked to the printer, there were my 12 presentation slides, and then, attached beneath them, for additional pages I had not sent. It took me a moment to understand what I was reading. My eyes kept sliding off the words like they didn't want to take them in. It was a purchase agreement. A condominium. A penthouse unit on the 14th floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue. The purchaser was listed as Mercer Holdings, LLC. The signatory was Graham Mercer. The purchase price was listed. The date of signing was 8 months prior. 8 months. That meant while I was preparing the Q3 supplier review in July, while I was sitting across from him at the kitchen table with my laptop, while I was reminding him about the calls he would miss and the people he needed to follow up with, this agreement already existed. Already signed. Already his. Attached to the agreement was an invoice from a furniture design firm. $87,000. Custom pieces, delivery, and installation. In the notes field at the bottom of the invoice, someone had typed, "For Graham and Olivia." Olivia was our director of marketing. She had been with the company for 2 years. Graham had hired her personally. He had said she had excellent strategic instincts. I stood at the printer for a long time. The pages were still warm from the machine. I thought about the word Olivia. I thought about how many times I had been in the same room as her at company events, making conversation, asking about her weekend, assuming the most ordinary interpretation of every interaction I had ever watched her have with my husband. I had been explaining away things I didn't want to name for a long time. I understood that now. I put my presentation slides on the desk and I looked at the other 4 pages for a while. Then I folded them once, lengthwise, and put them in the inner pocket of my jacket. Then I turned off the printer. Then I went to bed. Graham was already asleep. I lay next to him in the dark for a while. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I expected something large and loud. Instead, I felt something small and exact. Like a number clicking into place. Like a spreadsheet finally balancing. I had always known something was wrong. I just hadn't had the documentation before. I called Naomi Fletcher 3 days later. She had been recommended by a woman I met in a professional network I had quietly joined 8 months earlier, mostly to have a reason to leave the house on Tuesday mornings without explaining myself. Naomi worked out of an office on LaSalle Street, on the 6th floor of a building that was slightly too old to be prestigious and slightly too established to be cheap. Her desk had stacks of documents organized in a system only she understood. When she worked, she kept a small glass dish of mint-hard candies at the edge of the desk, and she went through them steadily, one after another, clicking them quietly against her teeth as she read. She didn't offer me one. She read the purchase agreement and the invoice without any visible reaction. Then she looked up at me and said, "Show me everything you've touched in that company." I said, "That might take a while." She said, "I have mint candies and a billing rate. We have time." She was not warm exactly. She was something better than warm. She was specific. Every question she asked had a clear purpose. She never asked me how I felt. She asked me what I could prove. That distinction mattered more than I can explain. I brought her everything over the following 2 weeks. I had kept copies of things. Not because I was planning anything. I am not a person who plans revenge. I am a person who keeps records because I believe records are how things become real. I have always believed that. I had copies of the original logistics system architecture I designed in 2017 with my name in the file metadata and my version notes in the margins. I had email threads where I negotiated contracts directly with suppliers, threads where I solved operational crises at 2 in the morning while Graham was in Denver at a conference. I had the operational manual I wrote for the Chicago office that was still being used as the onboarding document for new managers. I had drafts of speeches, drafts of pitches. I had a chain of emails from 2019 where I had caught an accounting error that would have cost the company $240,000 and where Graham had responded with 2 words, "Good catch." Not "great work." Not "thank you." "Good catch." Naomi read through all of it. She went through a significant portion of her candy supply. At the end of the 3rd session, she leaned back in her chair and said, "The operational fingerprints here are yours. Extensively and demonstrably yours." I said, "Yes." She said, "He's going to say you were a volunteer." I said, "He's going to say a lot of things." She picked up another mint candy and looked at me. "You're not upset," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. I said, "I processed the upset part already." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Good." The consulting offer came through a former client contact named William Park, who had worked with me on a vendor consolidation project 2 years earlier. He was moving to a logistics firm in Indianapolis as their new COO, and he needed someone to rebuild their operational infrastructure. He called me directly. Not through Graham. Not through the company. My personal number, which I had given him at a supplier conference in 2020 because he had a genuine question about freight routing and Graham was across the room talking about himself. He said, "I know this is unusual, but I always thought you were the one who actually knew how it worked." I asked him how he meant that. Not defensively. I just wanted to know what he had seen. He said, "Every time I had a technical question at those meetings, Graham would say he'd have someone follow up. The person who followed up was always you. And you always had the answer before I finished asking the question." I said I would need a few weeks to consider it. What I actually needed was to figure out whether I was the kind of person who could walk into a room of strangers and be the one they paid for answers, rather than the one who passed answers to someone else to deliver. I had been doing the work for a decade. I had never been the one standing at the front of the room. I practiced in my kitchen. Not a presentation, exactly. Just talking. Explaining how systems worked out loud to no one. I had spent so many years translating complex operational logic into simple summaries for Graham that I had forgotten I could just say the complex version directly to people who could handle it. It turned out I could. I signed the contract on a Wednesday morning in Naomi's office while she was eating a sandwich and reviewing a separate client file. The contract was for 14 months of operational consulting at a rate that was more than I had ever been paid for anything in my life. The check would go to an account in my name only. Graham did not know. There was no reason to tell him yet. I had opened a separate bank account 6 months earlier at a branch across town on one of my Tuesday mornings. It was nothing dramatic. It was just an account. My name, my social security number, a debit card that arrived in the mail and that I put in the inner pocket of my work bag behind my transit card. It sat there for months doing nothing. Just existing. Just being mine. The first change Graham noticed was that I stopped reminding him of things. For 10 years, I had been the memory of the household and the business both. His meetings, his calls, his commitments, his social obligations. I tracked them the way people track things they care about, which is to say automatically, without thinking about it, because the information mattered and someone had to hold it. I stopped holding it. Not loudly. Not all at once. I just became slightly less available. I responded to messages 20 minutes later than I usually did. I forgot to remind him about the Thursday call with the Denver office. I wasn't in the kitchen when he came down for coffee looking for the supplier contact he had asked me to pull 2 days ago. One evening he said, "You seem distracted." I said, "I've been busy." He looked at me for a moment like he was waiting for more. I went back to my laptop. A week later, at dinner, he said, "Are you upset about something?" I said, "No." "Why?" He said, "You just seem somewhere else lately." I said, "I've had a lot on my mind." He said, "Okay, but I need you present, Vanessa. I have the Harrington pitch next week, and I need you to look at the materials." I said, "Send them to me and I'll look." He sent them. I looked. I made 11 substantive corrections to the financial projections. I sent them back with no comment. He did not thank me. He sent the pitch and won the account. 3 days later, he told me we needed to talk. He sat me down in the living room of the house we had shared for 9 years. He was formal about it in the way men are formal when they have rehearsed something. He said he had been unhappy for a while. He said he thought they had grown apart. He said he thought they both deserved to be with people who made them happy. He said, "I think we should get divorced." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Okay." He was expecting something else. I could see it. He had prepared for something else. Some version of this conversation that involved more from me. More protest, or more anger, or more of me reaching across the distance between us to close it the way I always had. I said, "I'll call my lawyer tomorrow." He said, "You already have a lawyer?" I said, "Everyone should have a lawyer, Graham." He did not know what to do with that. The meeting was held in the main conference room of the Mercer Logistics Solutions headquarters on the 22nd floor of a glass building in the Loop. It was a Tuesday in late September. The room had a long table that seated 20. There were 12 people present, including Russell Pike, the chairman of the board, who had come in from his office in Milwaukee for the occasion. Graham had called it a business continuity meeting. He had framed it as a responsible step in the event of a change in leadership structure during the transition period around the divorce. He was being transparent, he said. He was being professional. He sat at one end of the table. He had a folder in front of him. He was wearing the navy suit. He looked composed. He had the particular composure of someone who is prepared for a negotiation and expects to win it. I came in with Naomi. I had a different folder. Much thicker. Graham looked at it, and then looked at me, and his expression changed in a way I cannot describe precisely except to say that it was the first time in 10 years I had seen him look uncertain. Not surprised. He was a man who didn't like to show surprise. But uncertain. Like the room had shifted slightly, and he needed a moment to recalibrate. Russell Pike greeted us formally. He shook Naomi's hand and then mine. He had met me a dozen times over the years at company events. I had sat next to him at 2 board dinners. He had always been polite in the way that people are polite when they are not sure exactly what category you belong to. This morning he looked at me differently. I don't think he knew he was doing it. Naomi did not waste any time. She distributed copies of a prepared summary to each person at the table. Then she walked through it section by section. The first section covered the operational history of the company. Specific systems, specific dates, file metadata, email trails. Naomi had organized it clearly and without embellishment. She did not editorialize. She just put information in front of people and let them look at it. Graham tried to interrupt twice in the first section. The first time he said, "This is being presented without context." The second time he said, I think we should clarify the nature of these contributions. Naomi said, we'll have time for clarification after the overview. He didn't interrupt a third time. The second section covered the corporate credit accounts, expenses that had been categorized as business development over a period of 2 years. A category that, when examined in detail, included regular payments to a North Michigan Avenue address, interior design services, furniture, a parking space lease. Paige Donovan opened her laptop before Naomi had finished the second page of the section. She was pulling internal records. Her fingers moved quickly over the keys, and she was not looking at anyone while she did it. The sound of her typing was the only sound in the room for almost a full minute. The third section was shorter. It covered a series of subsidiary LLCs that had been registered under the Mercer Holdings umbrella. Several assets had been shifted into these structures in the 18 months preceding the filing for divorce. Russell Pike removed his glasses. He set them on the table. He looked at the papers in front of him for a long time without speaking. One of the board members, a man named Victor Chin who handled the technology investment portfolio, said, very quietly, "You're saying she built the core operating infrastructure of this company?" Naomi said, "The documentation supports that conclusion, yes." Victor Chin said, "And she was never compensated as an officer or equity partner." Naomi said, "She was compensated as a spouse." Another board member said, loudly enough for everyone to hear it, "Graham, what is this?" Graham said, "These documents are being presented without context." Naomi said, "We're happy to provide more context. We have 11 additional folders." She did not have 11 additional folders. But she said it with complete calm, and nobody asked her to prove it. The moment I remember most precisely from that meeting is not the loudest one. It was quieter than that. One of the slides in the summary document was a screenshot of a spreadsheet. A vendor consolidation model I had built in 2018 that had saved the company approximately $400,000 in annual overhead. The slide showed the file properties panel, which listed the author as Vanessa Holt and the creation date as April 14, 2018. When that slide appeared on the screen, which Naomi had connected to the projector, the room went quiet in a particular way. Not an uncomfortable quiet. More like the quiet when something becomes true. Russell Pike put his glasses back on and looked at the screen. He said, "This has her name on it." Nobody responded. Because there was nothing to say. Graham looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked at his folder. Then he looked at the table in front of him, at a point between his hands. He did not have the leather notebook with him. I noticed that. The settlement took 4 months to finalize. Naomi was very good. Not flashy, not aggressive in a way that made things complicated. She was precise and she was patient, and she ate her way through an extraordinary number of mint candies over 4 months of negotiations. There were 3 separate mediation sessions. In the first one, Graham's attorneys argued that my contributions to the company were informal and personal in nature, consistent with the role of a supportive spouse rather than a business partner. They used the word supportive several times. They said it with a particular tone, as if support was a smaller category than work. Naomi put the 2017 system architecture documents on the table and asked Graham's lead attorney if he could explain what informal and personal meant in the context of a 46-page technical specification with my name in the metadata. The second session was shorter. What we established, through documentation and through the evidence of the hidden assets and the corporate fund misuse, was that a significant portion of the company's value had been created by unpaid labor I had performed for a decade. That this labor was documentable. That the assets, which had been shifted into subsidiary structures in anticipation of the divorce, constituted a form of dissipation. The outcome was not a dramatic number. It was a fair one. A portion of the company equity. A portion of the real estate. A settlement figure that reflected a decade of work without a salary. Not punishment. Proportion. Graham lost the support of 3 board members who had questions about the asset transfers. He lost control of the operational committee, which Paige Donovan, to her credit, insisted on restructuring after the meeting. She sent me an email the week after the board meeting. It was 3 sentences long. The last sentence was, "I should have said something sooner." I didn't respond to it for a week. Then I wrote back, "You said something now. That counts." Graham lost the story. He had told himself and everyone else for 10 years about how he had built something practically alone. He did not lose the company. I didn't want the company. I had already built it once. I did not need to do it again. The Indianapolis consulting work started in October. I drove down on a Monday morning, 4 hours south on I-65, and sat in a conference room with a logistics team that had real problems they needed someone to actually solve. I liked them. They were direct and tired and overworked, and they had no interest in pretending things worked when things didn't work. I rebuilt their freight coordination system in 11 weeks. They gave me a key card and a parking spot with my name on it. My name. On a sign. In a parking lot in Indianapolis. That was the first time my name was on anything professional in 11 years. He came to my office in November. I had rented space in a shared office building in Lincoln Park, of a reasonable size with good light and a view of trees that had already lost their leaves by then. I had a desk and a bookshelf and a coffee maker, and my laptop registered in my name, and nothing else I didn't choose. He knocked. I said, "Come in." He looked different than he had in the conference room. Smaller, somehow, though he was the same height. He was wearing the jacket with the inside pocket where the leather notebook lived. He sat down across from me. He said, "Vanessa, we could have handled all of this differently. Between us. Without involving the board." He said it gently. Almost warmly. Like we were two reasonable people who had simply made an administrative error. He said, "I think there's still a way forward that works for both of us." What he meant was, I want something back. He wanted the operational knowledge I was taking with me. He wanted access to my expertise again, but on terms he could manage. He wanted me back in the kitchen without admitting that's what he wanted. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached into the drawer on the left side of my desk. I took out the leather notebook. He stared at it. He hadn't seen it in months. I had taken it from the home office the same week I found the purchase agreement. Not dramatically. I just picked it up one morning and put it in my bag. I put it on the desk between us. He looked at it, and then he looked at me. I said, "You don't need to write anything down this time. Everything is already documented." He didn't respond. I said, "You treated me like I had no value for 10 years. The court calculated it differently." He sat there for a moment. I thought he might say something. He opened his mouth once and then closed it again. Then he stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He straightened it. He looked at me for one more moment, the look of a man trying to find the version of this conversation where he comes out ahead and not finding it. Then he left. I sat in the quiet for a while. The office building had its own sounds. An elevator somewhere, a phone ringing 2 doors down, traffic from the street below. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that was mine. After a few minutes, I looked down at the notebook. His hand had been on the cover for just a moment when he looked at it, and there was a faint print there from his palm. I opened the top drawer and took out a paper napkin. I wiped the cover clean. Then I put the notebook back in the drawer and got back to work. The divorce filing went public 2 weeks later. I found out because Paige sent me a 2-word text, "It filed." I read it, put my phone face down, and finished the vendor report I was working on for Indianapolis. There was nothing else to do. There is a parking spot in Indianapolis with my name on it. A small sign, black letters on white, in a concrete garage that smells like cold air and exhaust. Vanessa Holt. I never photographed it. I don't need to. I just park the car, walk into the building, and go to work. The same work I have always done. Just with my name on it now. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who takes your work is put your name on it. Not loudly. Just in the metadata. In the email header. In the careful, quiet record of what you actually did. That was not revenge. It was just the truth. The truth was always there. I made sure it could be seen. Tell me something. If you worked for 10 years building something that carried someone else's name, and you finally got the chance to let the record show what was actually true, would you take it? Or would you walk away and let the story stand? If Vanessa's story hit you the way it hit me, leave a like. It tells me this kind of story is worth telling. And if you want to see what happens when women stop being invisible and start being documented, subscribe. There are more stories coming.